World Cup wasn't for sale, then why did it have a $20 billion valuation? I read the news so that you don't have to. As you can see, this headline says FIFA's $20 billion commercial spin-off at risk as Europe unites behind World Cup boycott now. As you may have realized, the plans are now off. But if you're thinking, what was ever the issue? Come in close. Let me give you the 411 on why we saw possibly the biggest showdown in football since Patrick Vieira and Roy Keane met in that tunnel. So let me give you the general gist. This is largely about Gianni Infantino. He is the president of FIFA and he is, let's say, a little controversial. I'm not talking Tansu Obama controversy. No, my little ducks. I am saying that things have gotten so bad that people are loudly declaring that it was better with the former FIFA president, Sepp Blatter. Okay? The same Sepp Blatter that has been banned from football until 2028 and has had criminal complaints filed against him. So, what has Infantino done? The question is, what hasn't he done? Now, people have been talking about him for years, but things really started to get ridiculous in 2025 when a peace prize was created and awarded to the US president. Yes, Mr. Donald J. Trump. Now, that prize was awarded in December 2025, and then in January 2026, Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela and his wife were captured. Because, you know, nothing quite says peace like an extraordinary rendition. And you'll be forgiven if that slipped your mind, because we've had a lot to deal with. There's been a war launched against Iran, which was apparently to stop their nuclear capabilities, the same capabilities we were told they had already wiped out when they targeted it last year. But anyway, just put it this way, it's been a little messy. And suspicion has been mounting to fever pitch, pun intended, levels since Infantino appeared to be involved in, shall we say, unfair play during this year's World Cup. So there was the red card suspension, which was suspended, and was also multiple allegations of bias towards a certain player and a certain team. And when criticism from across the globe was launched against that player and specifically that team about the apparent shithousing that was on full display in many of the final matches, Infantino, it was then revealed, sent a kind of love letter to the country's FA, praising their magnificent performance. I know, it sounds like a lot, and Sherry's, let me just tell you, that is just the entree. So, what was this latest proposal about? So, FIFA controls the World Cup, the Club World Cup, and a collection of other competitions and commercial rights. And those tournaments generate enormous amounts through broadcasting, sponsorship, tickets, hospitality, and licensing. And so this new genius idea was to put significant part of that commercial business into a new entity, which was reportedly to have been valued around $20 billion, and then sell 20% of that to private investors. Now, if this had gone through, it would have raised billions in cash immediately. So FIFA were insisting that they're not selling the World Cup, right? And technically that was true because investors were not going to own the trophy or get to decide whether England play Brazil, but they would be buying into the commercial revenues generated around FIFA's competitions. Now, let's be serious. If you own part of the vehicle that earns money from the television rights, the sponsors, tickets, and hospitality, you've essentially bought an economic interest in the World Cup. You may not own the football, but you own part of the cash machine attached to it. And that distinction absolutely matters because as a registered non-profit, FIFA is supposed to govern football in the public interest. Private investment introduces a very different master: return on capital. Once outside investors pay billions for a stake, they will expect their investment to grow. Where does that growth come from? More tournaments, more matches, more expensive tickets, more premium hospitality, more sponsorship inventory, and more opportunities to interrupt football with something that can be sold. Hello, hydration breaks. And we've already seen this direction of travel before. The 2026 World Cup was expanded to 48 teams and 104 matches. We saw dynamic ticket pricing and these extraordinarily expensive hospitality packages which triggered criticism from supporters. At the moment, FIFA's answer to everything seems to be, how can we make this larger, longer, and more lucrative? And then you add in private investors and capital into that equation, and this is where the politics becomes quite interesting because FIFA has 211 member associations and everyone has an equal vote. Brazil gets one vote, Germany gets one vote, But so does Montserrat. In principle, that sounds democratic. In practice, it gives FIFA leadership enormous influence because many of the smaller associations depend heavily on the money that's distributed from the centre. Under versions of the investment proposal that were reported by the FT, associations could receive large upfront payments if the deal went ahead, potentially tens of millions each. Now, for wealthy European nations, that's a useful amount. For smaller associations with limited revenue, that amount can be transformative. So when associations would have been asked to vote on the proposal, we need to ask, would they be voting on development funding, or is this an inducement? Because when you think about it, if the people approving a transaction also stand to receive a life-changing payment from it, to be honest, the governance questions write themselves. And FIFA knew this, and they know exactly how powerful its distribution model is. Infantino became president after a corruption crisis that destroyed the old leadership. He promised reform, transparency, and a cleaner FA, but under his presidency, the organization has become increasingly centralized around him. He's cultivated relationships with political leaders, expanded FIFA's competition, and repeatedly found new ways to monetize the game. I don't know if you noticed, but one of the investors linked to the proposal deal is Joshua Kushner. And if that name sounds familiar, it may be because you've heard of Joshua's brother, Jared, who was a senior advisor to Donald Trump and is married to his daughter, Ivanka Trump. Now, obviously that doesn't prove any wrongdoing, but the context does matter. The World Cup has just taken place across the United States, Canada, and Mexico, and Infantino seemed to develop this unusually close public relationship with Trump. And then you have this Trump-connected billionaire reportedly positioned to lead an investment in FIFA's commercial future. At a minimum, that would demand extraordinary transparency. Who approached who? How was this valuation calculated? What protections are they? Etc. But there are some bigger questions. Why does FIFA even need this money at all? Look, FIFA is not some struggling family business desperate for a bank loan. They have accumulated billions in reserves and they earn extraordinary, and I'm telling extraordinary revenues during every World Cup cycle. And critics argue that FIFA could actually fund development from its own resources without permanently giving private investors a share in future tournament income. Selling equity is a different thing to borrowing. A loan eventually gets repaid, but equity, that can entitle an investor to profits indefinitely. So as you've seen, there was enormous backlash, and obviously the plan is apparently now kaput. We saw that UEFA's members united against the proposal, and that is a really big deal because the threat of European nations boycotting FIFA competitions, you could argue that the World Cup wouldn't even be recognizable. On top of that, CONCACAF were also opposed to it. So here we are. And I think this is what FIFA realized, because once associations representing many of the world's most commercially viable teams began discussing boycotts, the investment proposition just collapsed. And that's the irony, because FIFA's value comes from its players, its clubs, its nations, its fans. But the people creating that value are rarely the people controlling the transactions. Players were not designing the deal, supporters were not consulted, and clubs that release players were not leading it. The plan was being shaped within FIFA alongside bankers and investment funds. And guys, we've seen this film before. In 2021, some of Europe's richest clubs tried to create a breakaway Super League. JPMorgan was lined up to finance it, but the plan collapsed within days because supporters revolted against the idea that football's elite competition could be converted into a closed financial product. Now, JPMorgan were reportedly supposed to be involved in this newest FIFA commercial plan. It's a different structure, but it was the same underlying tension. Financial institutions, for their part, they see predictable global audiences, scarce content, and recurring revenue. But football supporters, we see heritage, identity, community, and competition. The money sees an asset. Fans, they see something that was never supposed to be available for purchase. Before anyone pretends that football has somehow remained pure until now, of course it hasn't. The World Cup has been commercial for decades. Sponsors shape the tournament, broadcasters influence kickoff times, countries spend billions hosting it for political prestige. FIFA itself has a long and extensively documented history of corruption. Private investors changes the incentives again, because the sponsor purchases exposure for a fixed period, but investor purchases an ownership stake and expects the underlying business to be managed for growth. That means that pressure doesn't just disappear after one tournament, it becomes embedded. And where have we seen this before? Housing, care homes, water companies, retail chains, football clubs. Investors arrive promising capital, expertise, and expansion. And sometimes investment genuinely improves a business. But once an institution is redesigned around investor returns, going back is extremely difficult. The World Cup works because people believe qualification matters. The national teams are representing something bigger than a balance sheet. Once every 4 years, billions of people are participating in this shared cultural event. FIFA monetizes that belief. There is a point at which monetization begins to destroy the very thing producing the value. So you can increase ticket prices until, ordinary supporters disappear. You can add matches until the competition just feels exhausting. And you can sell every pause in play until the game feels like just an advertising platform. You can keep extracting right up until people stop believing it belongs to them. And it seems like the immediate proposal has now been abandoned because opposition has been so strong. But the idea matters even if the exact deal dies, because somebody inside FIFA looked at the World Cup, a competition built over nearly a century by players, countries, and supporters, and decided that its future revenues could be packaged, valued, and sold to investors. And that tells us where football is heading. The question is no longer whether the World Cup is commercial. That argument ended decades ago. The question is whether football's commercialization now has any limits at all. Because FIFA says it wasn't selling the World Cup, but when investors are offered part of the money it generates, when associations are offered millions to approve the arrangement, and when people resisting have to threaten to boycott, what exactly would you call it?